In the long, winding story of Rome, there are emperors remembered as builders, philosophers, conquerors, and then, there is Commodus. His very name became a warning, a whispered reminder of how quickly power can rot from the inside. Imagine this, the Roman Empire at its height, its borders stretching farther than any kingdom on earth, its citizens accustomed to order, discipline, and a sense of divine destiny. And then, in 180 AD, a 19-year-old boy took the throne. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose writings on virtue and restraint still inspire leaders 2,000 years later. But where the father preached wisdom, the son brought chaos. Commodus believed he was Hercules reborn. He dressed in lion skins, carried a club, and demanded statues of himself as a god be placed across the empire. The Senate that once guided Rome, reduced to an audience, forced to cheer while their emperor fought drugged animals and mutilated prisoners in staged gladiatorial games. The imperial palace itself, once the nerve center of governance, became a brothel, a theater of cruelty where senators' wives, slaves, and even sacred priestesses were dragged into humiliating spectacles. This was not Rome's golden age, but its slow unraveling. For 13 years, Commodus turned the empire into his personal carnival of excess and fear. And in doing so, he planted a poison that spread through Roman politics, the economy, and the soul of its people. His reign did not simply end with his death, it marked the beginning of Rome's decline. So how did the empire of laws and legions fall prey to the madness of one man? Let's step into the world of Commodus. History often draws its deepest power from contrasts. Rome in the late 2nd century offers one of the starkest, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, and his son Commodus, the emperor who nearly brought the empire to its knees. Marcus Aurelius had spent much of his reign on the cold northern frontier, surrounded by tents and soldiers, writing meditations on virtue while leading campaigns to defend Rome from Germanic tribes. To him, power was a duty, not a privilege. He believed in restraint, in justice, in the heavy burden of leadership. In his writings, he constantly reminded himself, and future generations, that the emperor must be a servant of the people, a guardian of the state. But his son would inherit none of that. When Commodus ascended to the throne in 180 AD, he was just 19 years old. By birthright, he possessed everything a man could dream of: unthinkable wealth, the loyalty of legions, and the legitimacy of being heir to one of the greatest dynasties Rome had ever known. But beneath the crown lay a boy warped by privilege, haunted by rumors, and intoxicated by the idea of divine power. Some whispered that he was not Marcus' true son at all, but the product of his mother's affair with a gladiator. Whether true or not, the gossip cut to the heart of Rome's deepest anxieties, because gladiators were admired as entertainers, not rulers. That shadow of doubt, combined with his own temperament, set Commodus on a path his father could never have imagined. From the very beginning, Commodus showed little interest in governance. The machinery of empire, the endless petitions, the delicate diplomacy, the constant balancing of provinces and armies, bored him. Instead, he delegated those responsibilities to favorites, freedmen, and courtiers who were more than willing to exploit their proximity to power. Cleander, one of his most notorious advisors, sold government offices to the highest bidder. Military commands, senatorial seats, provincial governorships, positions that once required merit or loyalty, were now auctioned like merchandise. The system that had maintained Rome's strength began to rot from the inside. While Rome's institutions crumbled, Commodus was busy cultivating a different legacy. He declared himself the living embodiment of Hercules. Not in poetry or metaphor, but in flesh and blood. He dressed in lion skins, carried a heavy club, and demanded statues of himself as a god be raised throughout the empire. Coins minted in his reign depicted him not as a mortal ruler, but as Hercules reborn. He demanded citizens address him as a deity. This wasn't harmless theater, it was the foundation of a dangerous cult of personality. The Senate, that ancient body that had once guided the empire, looked on in horror. They had tolerated eccentric emperors before, Nero's excesses, Caligula's bizarre antics, but Commodus' obsession was different. He wasn't just indulging in spectacle, he was erasing the very dignity of the office. Senators were forced to attend his gladiatorial performances, sitting in silence as their emperor slaughtered crippled animals or helpless prisoners in rigged contests. Their humiliation was deliberate, engineered to remind them that the fate of Rome no longer rested in laws or traditions, but in the whims of a boy who thought himself a god. It was not enough for Commodus to be worshipped in public. Within the palace walls, his fantasies grew darker. Slaves later whispered of nights where the emperor forced participants to address him as Jupiter or Apollo, role-playing mythological scenes that spiraled into violence. Wives of senators were summoned under false pretenses, only to find themselves trapped in grotesque spectacles designed to humiliate both them and their husbands. Even the sacred vows of Vestal virgins were rumored to have been violated, though the sources remained deliberately vague, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect for the victims. And still, the empire paid the price. The treasury, carefully built up by Marcus Aurelius through years of austerity, was drained to fund his extravagances. Exotic animals, rare perfumes, silks from the East, all purchased to decorate banquets that lasted for days. These were not simple feasts, but theatrical productions. Guests were forced into roles, acting out mythological stories where failure to entertain the emperor could mean death. Money that should have funded legions defending the borders instead financed Commodus' endless games. To the average citizen, life under Commodus was a strange paradox. On one hand, he was generous with spectacles, filling the calendar with games and festivals. Bread and circuses had always been Rome's way of pacifying the masses, and Commodus leaned into it heavily. Yet beneath the entertainment was an undercurrent of fear. Anyone might be chosen as the next victim of his games, the next object of his humiliations. Citizens learned to avoid attention, to hide their wealth, even to disfigure their children to prevent them from catching the emperor's eye. Rome was no longer the city of order and law, it was a carnival of terror. Historians of the time struggled to make sense of what they were witnessing. Cassius Dio, a senator who lived through Commodus' reign, described the emperor's actions with barely concealed disgust. He wrote of an empire degraded, its institutions mocked, its people humiliated. Herodian, another chronicler, recounted the chants forced upon senators in the Colosseum, their voices raised not in debate but in sycophantic praise, "You are Lord and you are first. Of all men most fortunate, you win and you will win." This was not the Rome Marcus Aurelius had defended with sword and pen. This was something darker, something twisted. And yet, for 13 years, the empire endured it. The seeds of decline had been planted. The soldiers were restless, the provinces uneasy, the economy strained, the Senate humiliated. Commodus believed himself immortal, Hercules reborn. But the cracks in his reign were already spreading, and soon, they would shatter the empire's facade of strength forever. If Rome had once prided itself on discipline, hierarchy, and tradition, Commodus made it his mission to mock those very pillars. For him, the Colosseum was not a monument to Rome's power, it was his personal stage. From the earliest years of his reign, Commodus showed an almost childlike obsession with gladiatorial games. Unlike emperors before him, who might sponsor events to curry favor with the people, Commodus didn't want to be the patron of the spectacle. He wanted to be the star. Draped in lion skins and armed with a wooden club, he stepped into the arena not as Caesar, but as Hercules reborn. The games he staged were grotesque parodies of combat. Exotic beasts from Africa, lions, leopards, even elephants, were brought into the Colosseum, only to be drugged or maimed before the emperor faced them. Commodus, protected by guards, would land the final blow, raising his bloodied weapon high as the crowd roared. To the untrained eye, it was theater. To those who understood Rome's traditions, it was an insult. Real gladiators fought with courage, knowing death was always near. Commodus stripped away that danger, replacing honor with mockery. But the emperor's greatest targets were not the animals or the prisoners forced into combat. His real audience was the Senate. Senators, the descendants of an institution that had once ruled the Mediterranean, were compelled to sit in the front rows of the arena. They were not allowed to look away. They were not allowed to remain silent. When Commodus struck down a shackled man or wounded beast, the senators were forced to rise, applaud, and chant in unison. You are Lord and you are first. Of all men most fortunate, you win and you will win. From everlasting, victorious, you win. Imagine the humiliation. Rome's oldest families, men whose ancestors had fought Hannibal and debated the fate of nations, reduced to cheerleaders for a boy playing Hercules. It was not merely degrading. It was deliberate. Commodus enjoyed watching the guardians of Roman dignity squirm under his thumb. Each forced cheer was a reminder that their power was gone, their voices silenced, their prestige turned to ash. And the games were only one layer of his perversion of Roman life. Within the palace, the emperor recreated his own twisted version of the arena. Slaves reported being forced into elaborate role plays, with Commodus taking on the identities of gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Hercules, and demanding his partners address him accordingly. These scenes often turned violent, blurring the line between theater and cruelty. Wives of senators were summoned under false pretenses. To refuse was unthinkable, it was the emperor's command. Once inside the palace, they became unwilling actors in Commodus' grotesque fantasies. Husbands, powerless to protect their families, lived in constant dread. Some were forced to watch, their humiliation complete. Rome, a society that held family honor and marital fidelity as sacred, now saw its highest women degraded by the very man sworn to protect tradition. Rumors spread even of the Vestal Virgins, women whose chastity was tied to the very survival of Rome. While historians leave the details vague, whispers accused Commodus of coercing them into breaking their vows. For Romans, even the suggestion was horrifying. It was as if the sacred heart of the empire itself had been defiled. Yet, the emperor's appetites knew no limits. Ancient sources spoke of 300 concubines, split evenly between men and women, chosen for beauty across the empire. But these official partners were not enough. Commodus prowled the streets of Rome at night, disguised and flanked by gladiators and criminals. Citizens unlucky enough to cross his path might be beaten, abducted, even dragged into the palace for his amusement. Rome, once proud of its order, was ruled by fear. No one, man, woman, child, was safe from the emperor's whims. The economic cost of this madness was staggering. Each spectacle required endless resources. Exotic animals from distant provinces, delicacies from Arabia and China, elaborate costumes and sets for staged mythological reenactments. Gold that should have paid soldiers on the frontiers instead funded orgies and banquets that could last for days. The imperial treasury, carefully built up by Marcus Aurelius, bled dry. At one infamous feast, Commodus recreated scenes from mythology. Guests were forced to act as gods and heroes. But in the emperor's twisted version, those who failed to please him were punished, sometimes executed. Theatrical spectacle merged with cruelty, and survival depended not on honor but on flattery. The inversion of Rome's social order was perhaps the most corrosive aspect of Commodus' reign. Proud patricians were forced into servile roles, made to wait on gladiators elevated to positions of temporary authority. Slaves, criminals, and entertainers were lifted above Rome's governing class, not as a gesture of reform, but as mockery. Commodus wanted everyone to understand, in Rome, there was only one hierarchy, and it ended with him. Even the city itself was reshaped to fit his ego. Commodus renamed Rome Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. The months of the year were renamed after his titles. Religious ceremonies were twisted into rituals celebrating his divinity. Rome, once the eternal city, became a reflection of a single man's delusion. Historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian wrote with despair, but their words only capture fragments of the terror. Imagine living in a world where the emperor was both god and predator, where dignity, law, and tradition could be stripped away with a gesture. Imagine being a senator, forced to clap for the man who destroyed everything your ancestors built. Imagine being a parent, scarred by the fear that your child's beauty might catch the emperor's eye. For 13 years, Rome endured this. For 13 years, Commodus ruled not with justice or strategy, but with humiliation and excess. The city that once prided itself on order and discipline became the playground of a madman. But even as Commodus reveled in his power, the empire beneath him began to fray. The army, disgusted with its emperor, looked elsewhere for leadership. Provinces started to drift, realizing Rome's center no longer held. The people, once proud to be Roman, began to lose faith in what being Roman even meant. The arena, meant to celebrate courage and unity, had become a stage of degradation. And through it all, Commodus believed he was untouchable, a god in human form, immortal and invincible. But history has a way of turning on those who mock its traditions. And the same games that gave Commodus his stage would, in time, plant the seeds of his downfall. If the Colosseum was Commodus' public theater, then the imperial palace was his private stage. What took place behind its gilded walls was far darker than anything seen in the arena. The emperor's home, once the seat of Rome's governance, was transformed into something closer to a sprawling brothel. Slaves whispered of corridors filled with drunken laughter, of torchlit halls echoing with screams, of chambers where the emperor acted out fantasies that twisted Rome's most sacred traditions into parodies. Here, Commodus no longer needed to pretend. The eyes of the people were far away. Within these walls, he could shape reality to his own desires, unchallenged and unchecked. Wives of senators were frequent targets. They were summoned to the palace under pretexts of banquets or imperial audiences. To refuse was impossible, defying the emperor could mean death, not only for themselves but for their families. Once inside, they found themselves trapped in elaborate scenarios. Some were forced to play the roles of mythological figures in grotesque reenactments of stories that should have symbolized honor and virtue. Instead, the emperor twisted them into spectacles of humiliation and violation. Husbands, Rome's proud aristocrats, lived in perpetual dread. They knew that their wives might be called, and they also knew that they could do nothing to stop it. A man's honor in Rome was tied to his household, his wife, his children, his reputation. Commodus shattered that honor deliberately. Forcing a senator's wife into his games wasn't only about personal pleasure, it was a demonstration of absolute power. By corrupting their families, Commodus reminded the Senate that even their private lives belonged to him. The whispers did not end there. Even the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, sworn to chastity for 30 years, were rumored to have been coerced. These women, whose purity symbolized the survival of Rome itself, became pawns in the emperor's fantasies. Though ancient historians leave the details vague, the accusation alone was enough to horrify the Roman public. If Commodus could defile the Vestals, what limit could possibly restrain him? Beyond these horrors, Commodus maintained an official collection of 300 concubines, half women, half young men, selected from every corner of the empire. They were housed in the palace, dressed in finery, and paraded like trophies. But even this stable of beauty could not satisfy him. Night after night, Commodus disguised himself and roamed the streets of Rome, accompanied by gladiators and criminals. Citizens unlucky enough to be caught might be beaten, robbed, or dragged back to the palace for his amusement. For ordinary Romans, fear became a constant companion. Families scarred their children intentionally, making them less attractive in hopes of avoiding the emperor's notice. Some sent their sons and daughters to distant provinces, praying they would be safer far from the capital. The empire's wealthiest citizens built lives of deliberate mediocrity, dressing down, hiding their fortunes, doing anything they could to avoid drawing the gaze of the emperor. And all of this had a staggering cost. The imperial treasury, once carefully preserved by Marcus Aurelius, was bled dry to sustain these excesses. Commodus demanded exotic luxuries, perfumes from Arabia, silks from China, rare delicacies from Africa. He staged orgies and banquets that lasted for days, each one more elaborate than the last. Guests were forced into roles, compelled to act out mythological stories. Some were humiliated, others punished or even executed if they failed to please the emperor's warped imagination. One notorious event involved the reenactment of gods' violent exploits. Participants believed they were attending a festival of art and celebration. But as the hours wore on, they discovered the scenes had been designed as traps. Heroes were degraded, goddesses were violated, and those who resisted were slain before the emperor's eyes. Rome's mythology, its shared cultural language, was desecrated for Commodus' private amusement. Psychological cruelty often matched the physical. Victims were forced to praise him during their ordeals, compelled to compose poems glorifying his strength even as they suffered. Those who faltered were punished severely. Commodus delighted in inversion, turning nobles into slaves, while lifting slaves and gladiators into positions of mock authority. For the emperor, this was not random chaos. It was a calculated demonstration. Rome's hierarchy, its honor, its values existed only at his pleasure. Even Rome itself was not spared from this corruption. Commodus renamed the city after himself, Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. The very identity of the Eternal City was rewritten to reflect the emperor's vanity. Months of the year were changed to variations of his names and titles. Temples were rededicated to his glory. Traditional religious ceremonies were reshaped into bizarre hybrids, combining Roman rites with Commodus' personal fantasies. Participants were forced into acts that violated taboos, all under the pretense of sacred ritual. This was more than arrogance. It was a systematic perversion of the structures that defined Roman life. The emperor had not only stripped the Senate of dignity and the people of security, he had defiled the very soul of Rome. Historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian describe these years with open disgust, but their words can only hint at the atmosphere of terror. Imagine being a senator, waiting for the day your wife's name might appear on the imperial summons. Imagine being a father, praying your child's face never caught the emperor's eye. Imagine walking Rome's streets at night, never knowing if the disguised figure lurking in the shadows was your ruler. For 13 years, the palace echoed with laughter and screams, a grotesque reflection of one man's desires. And yet, while Commodus played at being a god, the empire he ruled began to crumble. The treasury was emptying. The army grew restless. Provinces whispered of rebellion. Rome was losing its identity. Still, Commodus believed himself untouchable. He was Hercules, Jupiter, Apollo. He was the master of Rome, the master of the world. But even the strongest illusions eventually shatter. And in Commodus' palace, amid the torches and orgies, the seeds of conspiracy were beginning to take root. If the palace was drowning in excess, the empire itself was suffocating. Every coin spent on Commodus' fantasies was a coin stolen from Rome's survival. And soon, the cracks in the empire's financial and social foundations began to spread. For generations, Rome's strength had rested on a delicate balance, legions paid on time, provinces taxed but protected, trade routes secured by the watchful presence of the Roman navy. Under Commodus, that balance collapsed. The imperial treasury, carefully built up by Marcus Aurelius and his predecessors, was drained almost overnight. Exotic animals were imported from Africa and Asia to die in Commodus' staged hunts. Perfumes from Arabia, silks from China, rare spices from India, all bought in staggering quantities to fuel his banquets. Skilled slaves, trained in arts that Roman moralists dared not even describe, were purchased at astronomical prices. Money that should have gone to the legions on the Danube or the defense of the eastern provinces vanished into smoke, wine, and silk. But when the treasury emptied, Commodus did not restrain himself. He found new ways to fill it, through extortion, confiscation, and corruption. Wealthy citizens suddenly found themselves accused of treason or conspiracy. Their estates were seized, their families disgraced, their names struck from public records. Senators and equestrians knew the rules had changed, wealth was no longer a shield, but a target. The greater a man's fortune, the more likely he would be marked for imperial plunder. Meanwhile, the sale of offices reached unprecedented heights. Cleander, Commodus' infamous chamberlain, openly auctioned the most powerful positions in the empire. Military commands, provincial governorships, even the consulship, the highest civilian office in Rome, were sold to the highest bidder. Competence no longer mattered, loyalty to Rome no longer mattered. What mattered was gold, and the willingness to flatter Commodus. The consequences were devastating. Provinces were governed by men who cared little for their subjects, interested only in recovering the fortunes they had spent to buy their positions. Legions were commanded by officers who had purchased their titles rather than earned them through merit or discipline. Justice itself became transactional. For the right bribe, a man could secure a favorable verdict in court, or the dismissal of a dangerous charge. Rome's proud system of merit, the very foundation of its administration, was rotting. The economic effects rippled outward. Trade routes became less secure, as soldiers went unpaid and patrols thinned. Farmers, burdened with heavy taxes to fund Commodus' pleasures, abandoned their land. Many fled to the countryside, seeking refuge with wealthy landlords who could shield them from imperial tax collectors. Agriculture declined, cities shrank, and in some regions, commerce reverted to barter. The empire that had once bound the Mediterranean together with coin and law was fragmenting into pockets of survival. And yet, inside Rome, the emperor's spectacles continued. He provided bread and circuses to the masses, distributing food and staging games on an unprecedented scale. At first, this kept the common people distracted. But even among them, fear crept in. To be noticed by Commodus was dangerous. A beautiful daughter might be summoned to the palace. A skilled craftsman might be forced to create toys for the emperor's amusements rather than serve his community. Ordinary citizens learned that survival meant invisibility. The Senate fared even worse. Its members, once the stewards of Roman dignity, lived in constant humiliation. Not only were they forced to cheer at Commodus' staged victories in the arena, but their very households were under siege. Wives summoned, children threatened, estates seized. What remained of their power was hollow, their traditions mocked. Religion, too, was corrupted. As Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, Commodus was supposed to safeguard sacred rituals. Instead, he turned them into parodies. Traditional ceremonies of fertility and marriage were twisted into obscene performances. Temples were defiled with acts that blurred the line between sacred and profane. Priests, once revered, were forced to stand by in silence or risk imperial wrath. For the devout, it was not only sacrilege but an existential crisis. If the emperor himself mocked the gods, what protection did Rome truly have? And yet, out of this darkness, new movements gained strength. Mystery cults flourished, offering hope outside the corrupted state religion. Mithraism, with its secret rites and promises of brotherhood, attracted soldiers disgusted by their commander-in-chief. Christianity, still illegal but growing, provided an even stronger alternative. It offered justice not in this world, but in the next, a divine reckoning where tyrants would be punished and the righteous rewarded. Under Commodus, faith itself became a quiet form of resistance. The social order inverted by the emperor also left lasting scars. Gladiators and slaves were elevated above senators and patricians. Proud families watched in horror as their honor was trampled. The fabric of Roman identity, Romanitas, was tearing apart. To be Roman had always meant discipline, order, dignity. But what did it mean when the supreme Roman lived only for cruelty and excess? Philosophers asked themselves this question with growing despair. The Stoics, who had flourished under Marcus Aurelius, were silenced or forced to provide shallow justifications for Commodus' madness. Libraries were neglected, education crumbled, and the moral foundation of Roman life seemed hollow. Teachers struggled with impossible contradictions. How could they instruct students in virtue when vice ruled the palace? The empire itself began to internalize the trauma. Citizens developed strategies of survival, muted celebrations, hidden children, mediocrity as protection. Art became propaganda, literature flattery, philosophy retreat. Creativity, that spark which had carried Rome across continents, flickered under the shadow of fear. And beyond Rome, the world was watching. Foreign ambassadors wrote back to their kings, describing scenes of debauchery and humiliation. Rome's prestige, the aura that had kept enemies at bay, was unraveling. The Parthians probed the eastern frontiers. Germanic tribes raided the north. Rome was vulnerable, not because its legions were weak, but because its emperor cared only for the stage, the bedchamber, and the banquet hall. The empire was bleeding. Its gold, its honor, its identity, all flowing away into the abyss of one man's delusion. And yet Commodus, wrapped in lion skins and perfumed with incense, believed himself eternal. He renamed the months, he renamed the city, he raised statues of himself as a god. He was Hercules reborn, Jupiter incarnate, Apollo on earth. But beneath the marble and silk, the empire was rotting. The soldiers were restless, the provinces disillusioned, the people fearful. Commodus had traded Rome's future for his own pleasures. And while he reveled in his false divinity, his enemies, within and without, were quietly gathering strength. Rome's greatness had always rested on its armies. Legions stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern frontier stood as both shield and symbol, disciplined, professional, and loyal to the empire above all. Under Commodus, that shield began to splinter. At first, soldiers remained silent. They endured unpaid wages, delayed supplies, and commanders chosen not for skill but for wealth. Commodus had sold commissions to the highest bidder, transforming military leadership into a marketplace. Men who should never have led anything more than a household now commanded thousands of troops. The results were disastrous. On the frontiers, discipline broke down. The Germanic tribes across the Danube sensed weakness and increased their raids. In the east, Parthian forces probed Roman defenses, emboldened by reports of a distracted emperor. Ambassadors returned home with tales not of Roman might, but of an emperor dressed in lion skins, fighting crippled animals in the arena. Rome's enemies laughed, and then they struck. Within the empire, the soldiers themselves began to change. The esprit de corps that had defined the legions for centuries eroded. Soldiers no longer looked to Rome for authority. Instead, they looked to their immediate commanders, the generals who could reward them, protect them, or at least shield them from the emperor's madness. Loyalty shifted from empire to individuals, a subtle change that would, in time, ignite civil wars. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors of the emperor, were caught in an impossible bind. Sworn to defend Caesar, they found themselves witnesses to his darkest excesses. Worse, Commodus used them in his private games, forcing seasoned warriors to play humiliating roles in his fantasies. Some were made to kneel as slaves, others were compelled to act as props in obscene performances. For men of honor, it was intolerable. Their armor was polished, their swords sharp, but their dignity was stripped away. Many would never forgive it. Diplomacy, too, began to unravel. Rome had long relied on a careful balance of intimidation and respect. Foreign rulers had feared Roman discipline, but they had also respected its order. Under Commodus, that order dissolved. Negotiators sent to Parthia were more interested in procuring exotic delicacies and beautiful captives for their emperor than in maintaining peace. Germanic chieftains quickly learned that they could secure concessions not by battle, but by sending handsome hostages and alluring maidens to Rome. Bribery replaced strategy, appeasement replaced deterrence. The ripple effects were profound. Trade agreements broke down. Merchant ships avoided routes that had once been the empire's lifeblood, fearing piracy and instability. Diplomacy, once Rome's silent weapon, became another theater of mockery. And yet, even as the empire frayed, Commodus seemed oblivious. He continued to see himself as invincible, Hercules reborn. He announced plans to celebrate the new year of 193 AD by emerging from the gladiator barracks, dressed as a gladiator consul, ready to rule Rome not from the Senate but from the arena. For Romans who still clung to tradition, the idea was unthinkable, the emperor debasing himself before the mob, reducing the dignity of centuries to cheap spectacle. The Senate, already humiliated, began to seethe in silence. The soldiers, their patience spent, whispered among themselves. Even those closest to Commodus, his chamberlain Eclectus, his mistress Marcia, his prefect Laodice, recognized that their lives hung by a thread. One wrong gesture, one bad day, and imperial favor could turn into imperial execution. Conspiracies were born not from ambition, but from desperation. Marcia discovered her own name on one of Commodus' execution lists. Eclectus, who had served faithfully for years, realized he would never leave the palace alive. Laodice, commander of the Praetorian Guard, saw his men humiliated and his own position crumbling. Together, they began to plan. The empire itself seemed to conspire with them. Every institution Commodus had mocked, every life he had broken, every soldier he had humiliated, each provided another reason to end his reign. It was no longer about restoring dignity. It was about survival. And still, Commodus remained blind. In his mind, he was adored, feared, invincible. He believed his statues would stand for eternity, his name echoing like that of Hercules. He never imagined that the very people closest to him, the ones who poured his wine, warmed his bed, and guarded his chambers, would be the ones to seal his fate. The sword of Rome had frayed. The army no longer respected him. Diplomats no longer feared him. Senators no longer believed in him. And the guards sworn to protect him were plotting in silence. The empire had bled long enough. The blade was ready to strike. By the winter of 192 AD, Commodus stood at the height of his delusion. He had renamed Rome after himself, renamed the months of the year, raised countless statues portraying himself as Hercules. He had drained the treasury, humiliated the Senate, degraded the army, and turned religion into parody. Yet he still believed he was eternal. The plan for the coming year confirmed his madness. On New Year's Day, 193 AD, Commodus intended to march into the city not as emperor, but as consul dressed in gladiator's garb. He would begin the year from the gladiator barracks, formally declaring himself Rome's warrior ruler. To the Romans, who saw the consulship as the pinnacle of civic duty, this was unthinkable. For their emperor to treat it as another act in his grotesque theater was beyond insult. It was also the breaking point. Among those closest to him were three who had everything to lose. Marcia, his mistress, once favored but always fearful of his unpredictable rage. Eclectus, his chamberlain, who had witnessed years of cruelty and excess, and knew too much to ever be safe. And Laodice, commander of the Praetorian Guard, torn between duty and honor, watching as his men were degraded beyond endurance. One evening in late December, Commodus drafted an execution list. On it were senators, officers, and Marcia's name. When she discovered it, her choice became clear: kill or be killed. She confided in Eclectus and Laodice, and the conspiracy was born. The plan was simple. Commodus would be poisoned. If that failed, other measures would follow. On December 31st, as the emperor prepared for his New Year's spectacle, Marcia offered him a cup of wine after his bath. Laced within it was poison. Commodus drank greedily, unsuspecting, and soon his stomach churned. For a moment, it seemed the deed was done. But the emperor vomited, purging the poison from his body. He staggered, furious and suspicious. Panic surged through the conspirators. If Commodus realized the truth, they were finished. It was then that Laodice summoned a man named Narcissus, a professional wrestler and Commodus' training partner. The emperor, weakened from the poison, retreated to his bath. Narcissus entered, perhaps pretending to help, perhaps with silent determination. He grabbed Commodus from behind, pressing his massive arms around the emperor's neck. The god-emperor struggled. This was no arena with drugged beasts or chained prisoners. This was real combat, and for once, Commodus faced an opponent who fought back. He thrashed in the water, clawed at Narcissus' grip, but his strength was no match. Slowly, the life drained from him. The emperor who believed himself immortal, the man who demanded worship as Hercules, died naked, gasping, and helpless in his own bath. It was not the glorious death he imagined. No thunder of the crowd, no cheers of victory. Only the silent strength of a wrestler and the weight of his own crimes pressing down like iron chains. When news spread through the palace, there was no mourning. There was relief. The Senate, long humiliated, wasted no time. They declared Commodus a public enemy. They ordered damnatio memoriae, the erasure of his memory. Statues were torn down, inscriptions chiseled away, his name cursed and removed from monuments. The city's name reverted to Rome, the months returned to their traditional titles, and the empire tried to scrub away the stain of his reign. But erasure could not undo the damage. Commodus' 13 years of madness had hollowed out the empire. The treasury was ruined, the army demoralized, the provinces restless. And with his death, the imperial succession collapsed into chaos. The year that followed would be remembered as the year of the 5 emperors, a time of civil war, betrayal, and blood. Yet even as Rome lurched into new crises, Commodus' death remained symbolic. The emperor who had believed himself divine was killed not by an army, not by a rival general, but by those closest to him, his mistress, his chamberlain, his guard. The man who had forced senators to chant his glory, who had renamed the eternal city after himself, was reduced to a corpse strangled in silence. Historians from Cassius Dio to Herodian to the Historia Augusta wrote with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. They saw in Commodus not merely a wicked ruler, but the embodiment of Rome's decline. Edward Gibbon, centuries later, would mark his accession as the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. And he was right, after Commodus, Rome would never be the same. The people who lived through his reign bore scars that outlasted him. Families broken, honor destroyed, faith corrupted, children scarred to protect them from imperial lust. Rome's confidence, that deep belief in its destiny, its virtue, its superiority, was gone. Commodus had proven that even Rome could become un-Roman, that even the greatest civilization could be twisted into mockery. The irony was cruel. Commodus craved immortality. He renamed months, cities, legions, believing his name would echo forever. And in a way, it did. But not as he hoped. History remembers not Commodus the god, but Commodus the madman. Not as Hercules reborn, but as a warning etched in time, proof that absolute power can corrupt absolutely. His statues were smashed, his inscriptions erased. But his story survived, told again and again as a cautionary tale. To medieval monks, he was divine punishment. To Renaissance scholars, he was the tyrant who justified republicanism. To modern historians, he was the turning point, the moment the empire's decline began. And so Commodus achieved immortality after all, though not in the way he imagined. He became the ghost haunting Rome's memory, the shadow lurking behind every throne, the name invoked whenever rulers forgot that power must be bound by conscience. On the last night of 192 AD, the god emperor died like a man. And Rome, though it breathed a sigh of relief, would never fully recover. When dawn broke on the first day of 193 AD, Rome awoke to a strange silence. The emperor who had demanded to be worshipped as Hercules reborn, the man who had renamed months and cities after himself, lay dead in his bath. Strangled not by an army or a foreign invader, but by a slave's arms. At first, the city breathed relief. The Senate convened with a freedom it had not felt in over a decade. Voices once muted rose in unison to declare Commodus a public enemy. The decree of damnatio memoriae, erasure of memory, fell swiftly. His statues were smashed, his inscriptions chiseled away, his name stripped from every monument that bore it. Months were returned to their original names, the city's proud identity restored. For the senators who had endured humiliation in the Colosseum, forced to chant praises for a false god, it was an act of vengeance cloaked in ceremony. But the relief was hollow. Commodus' shadow still hung heavy. The empire he left behind was not the Rome of his father Marcus Aurelius. The treasury was ruined, its coffers emptied into spectacles and banquets. The army was fractured, loyalty divided, discipline shattered. Provinces had grown restless, governors emboldened by the emperor's neglect. The people themselves had been scarred, forced into silence, into hiding, into fear. Rome's spirit, its belief in its own destiny, had been broken. Worse still, his death did not bring stability. Instead, it opened the gates to chaos. With Commodus gone, no clear successor stood ready. The Praetorian Guard, already corrupted by years of indulgence and humiliation, auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. What followed was the year of the 5 emperors, a maelstrom of civil wars, assassinations, and shifting allegiances that further eroded Rome's strength. The precedent had been set, emperors were no longer secure by tradition or law, but by the sword and the coin. For many Romans, the greater wound was philosophical. Commodus had shown that the empire could be ruled not by law, not by virtue, but by whim. That the man entrusted with absolute power could use it not to defend civilization, but to degrade it. Romanitas, the essence of being Roman, had always rested on discipline, duty, and respect for tradition. Commodus mocked all of it. His reign left citizens asking a haunting question: if this is what Rome's ruler can become, what does it mean to be Roman? This identity crisis echoed for generations. Philosophers who once celebrated Marcus Aurelius' Stoic wisdom now pointed to his son as proof of the dangers of dynastic succession. Neoplatonists spoke of souls corrupted by material excess. Christians saw Commodus as the embodiment of pagan corruption, his depravity proof of Rome's moral bankruptcy and a sign of divine judgment. To them, his death prepared the way for Christianity's eventual triumph, offering a moral framework untouched by imperial corruption. Even centuries later, Commodus' reign haunted the imagination. Medieval chroniclers saw him as a tyrant punished by God. Renaissance humanists used him as the perfect example of why republics were safer than monarchies. Modern historians, with the benefit of archaeology and analysis, confirmed the scale of his excesses. To Edward Gibbon, his accession marked the beginning of Rome's decline and fall. And yet, Commodus himself achieved what he wanted most: immortality. Not as a god, not as a hero, but as a warning. His name endures as shorthand for corruption, decadence, and the perils of unchecked power. He stands alongside Caligula and Nero, not in glory but in infamy. The legacy of Commodus was not only political or economic. It was psychological. He taught Rome a truth it had long resisted: civilization is fragile. The marble, the laws, the traditions, all of it could crumble if entrusted to a man without conscience. He proved that power without restraint is poison, not only to the ruler but to the society he governs. For the citizens who survived his reign, the scars never fully healed. Families broken by imperial lust. Children scarred to protect them from the emperor's gaze. Senators stripped of dignity, soldiers stripped of honor, priests forced into blasphemy. The memory of those years lingered like a wound that would never close. In the centuries that followed, Rome would endure many crises: invasions, plagues, civil wars. But Commodus' reign remained a turning point. It marked the moment when Rome itself began to doubt, when the belief in eternal destiny gave way to uncertainty. When the empire's greatest strength, its centralized authority, revealed itself as a fatal weakness in the hands of a madman. And so the story of Commodus is told again and again. Not as a curiosity of ancient history, but as a lesson for every age. His life reminds us that power, left unchecked, can corrode even the greatest of civilizations. That the line between order and chaos is thinner than we imagine. That a single ruler's madness can scar millions. Commodus wanted to be remembered as Hercules reborn, the immortal conqueror. Instead, he is remembered as the mad emperor, the man who turned Rome's majesty into mockery. His immortality came not from statues or renaming cities, but from the cautionary tale he left behind. And perhaps that is the final irony. In striving to be a god, Commodus became something far more enduring: a ghost, forever haunting the memory of Rome.